Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joe Besford. We're running a webinar today on patient data choices, which is the RCGP project, where we're looking at how we are preparing general practice teams for the national data opt-out and providing information and guidance on all around that. This webinar is called Understanding the National Data Opt-out. We hope to cover some of those issues. So, if I find okay. The main aims of this webinar are to actually explore a little deeper on what the National Data Opt-out is, when and how it will be applied. This is probably something that's quite new to a lot of people, so we're hoping to raise awareness about what's going on. We'll also be exploring some of the key aspects of the National Data Opt-out and how they'll be addressed by the RCGP toolkit and e-learning, and some of the things that the RCGP is doing to prepare general practice teams for this when it's implemented. We also want to highlight what support should be given to patients and how to answer queries around this, as we understand and recognise that patients and public, in fact, will probably come to their general practice teams that they know in order to ask questions. It's highly likely that it's first port of call. So I just want to first of all flag some key dates before we get to the panel. The opt-out itself, National Data Opt-out, will be launched on the 25th of May, and we are actually running an event on the 24th of May, which will be a national event, and it's aimed at everybody that's involved in the general practice team, primary care. And we hope to cover some of the same topics, but we're also interested in communicating choice and trust and being transparent and some of those key concepts, and hope you can join us then. Everybody that's registered for this webinar will send through the link to the event and some more information about it, so you can look through that. But just to say that we have Dame Fiona Cullycott joining us, who is the National Data Guardian, and Helen Stokes-Lampard, who's the chair for the RCGP as well. I think we'll sort of move on to the next section. Just to let you know, we will have a Q&A session as part of this webinar. That'll follow a few presentations that will first of all set the scene for the opt-out and what's happening. And then we'll talk about what the RCGP is doing through its Patient Data Choices programme. And then we'll also talk about, dig a little bit deeper into what that guidance looks like, and hopefully share some of the key messages around this area. We would like very much if you could submit questions to us. So we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. We've got some questions that we've received already from colleagues and from the people that we've been engaging with in the events and webinars that we've already been running. So we'll be covering some of those, but by all means, send your questions in. There's information on screen asking how to do that, and I think, in fact, if you're struggling with that, you can get in touch with the administrator who will be able to help, but it's pretty straightforward text box, which you should be able to see at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Put them in there. We won't answer the questions straight away. We're going to work through the slides, first of all, do our presentations, and then we'll come to your questions. But if you could send them in as this goes on, that'd be great, and we'll pick them up when we come to the Q&A session. So, first of all, I'd like to hand over to the panel and introduce ourselves. We've got these slides slightly the wrong way around. I'll just introduce myself first. It makes sense as I'm talking. My name is Joe Besford. I am the Programme Manager in the Clinical Innovation and Research Centre at the RCGP. I am the manager of this project, and I also manage the Patient Online project as well. And I've worked at the college for about 18 months or so, and previously worked in the Health Informatics Unit at the RCP.
I'm Geoff Schrecker. I started in medicine in 1979 as a GP in 1991, and I've been heavily involved in use of IT, proper use of IT, use of data, really, since I tried to do my RCGP membership audit in 1991 in my training practice. And I have got the honour of being the clinical champion for patient data choices for the RCGP.
Hi everyone, I'm Dawn Friend. I'm a local implementation manager for as part of the National Data Opt-out programme within NHS Digital. So with NHS Digital, we're responsible for the operational delivery of the National Data Opt-out. So I'm now going to kick off with setting the scene a little to help you understand a little bit more about the National Data Opt-out, so what it is, where it's come from, why we need it, and how it differs from what we have now. So starting off really with what it is and where it's come from. It's widely recognised that better use of information and data has potential to transform health and care for everybody. But it's also recognised that people want to know that their privacy and their rights are safeguarded. So the Secretary of State for Health commissioned the National Data Guardian, Dame Fiona Caldicott, to do a review of data security and data sharing. And that review, called the Review of Data Security, Consent and Opt-outs, was published in July 16. Just about everything in that independent review was acknowledged and accepted by the government's response in July 17. So some of the key points from that were that the public need to know that they are protected by the law, and that information is essential for high quality care for the individual, but that also it's beneficial for other purposes beyond that individual care. But the report also said that we should give the patients the right to opt out of their information being used for those purposes beyond individual care. So, you know, the quote on the slide is that a patient be able to do this once and be confident that it can be applied across the health and care system. One key point to make is she also made it very clear that it wouldn't affect individual care. So the use of data for individual care would not be affected by the National Data Opt-out. Okay, so how's it going to work? NHS Digital are working to implement some of the kind of practical solution for how this National Data Opt-out will work. So just broadly speaking, the opt-out will be able to be set by the patient themselves, either digitally or non-digitally, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. The National Data Opt-out will then be stored once centrally, and organisations needing to apply that National Data Opt-out to any data uses or data disseminations can do that by referencing that central store of the opt-out. So there's no need for everybody to hold a register of those patients. And the idea is it's simple to do so. NHS Digital will be upholding those opt-outs, those National Data Opt-outs, from the 25th of May, when this is all becomes available to the public. And other health and care organisations are expected to uphold by 2020. Now, the Department of Health and Social Care will be setting out a roadmap for that and a strategy and how to communicate clearly to the public when different types of organisations will be upholding that opt-out between this May and 2020. So the approach for this and the background and the context really is not about a call to action to opt out. And in fact, the approach with the public is in the context of a wider public campaign by the Information Commissioner's Office around linking really to some of the changes in the law that are coming along, but also just to increase that transparency and public awareness and understanding of their rights when it comes to data, and building that sort of trust and confidence in the use of data, and helping those who are already interested in such things to find more information and find out what their choices are. So really those messages are that, you know, we need to be transparent about use of data, but that there is this choice if you want to access it. On top of that, also there is going to be support for health and care organisations. So for the workforce that are speaking to the public, as Jo mentioned earlier, patients may ask questions, but also some more detailed support for those specialist folk in the workforce and the organisation. So those dealing with information governance and that kind of know that level of detail, and those dealing with data flows, data uses and dissemination. So for the public, how will they find out about it? As illustrated on the slide here, there are many ways they may find out about it through that public comms we were just talking about transparency and data use. They may see a poster or some materials in a health and care setting, and I'll talk a bit more about that. They may speak to a healthcare professional or a member of one of your teams. All of those routes basically will need to lead into the National Data Opt-out Service, so the NHS UK materials and the central materials. So that's kind of all routes are about signposting patients to further information, as we set out previously. A few practicalities about how a patient can set a National Data Opt-out, which is useful to see. Anyone aged 13 or over who's registered on the PDS, so the Personal Demographic Service in England, will be able to set an opt-out from the 25th of May. They'll be able to do that either digitally, so via the service on which will be hosted on NHS UK, so our patient-facing presence. They can do that computer, smartphone, tablet, and they will be verified their identity using their NHS number, date of birth, and there will be the standard kind of two-factor authentication on that. So though recognising that not everybody is able to or would like to use a digital service, there'll also be a telephone route, so via the NHS Digital Contact Centre, where there'll be an assisted digital channel, so that's where patients might want a bit of help or to talk through what they're doing themselves online, or there will be an on behalf of service where the contact centre will do the transaction or go through it with the patient, but the patient will still be in control of it. Or there is a non-digital route, recognising that not everybody has an email or a mobile phone, and there will be a paper-based service. The important thing to note about this is that the absence of the GP practice involvement in setting the opt-out. So that's just something that we'll sort of pick up later. Formal proxies will be recognised, so parental or lasting power of attorney, they can be recognised and they can use the non-digital channel for those patients who will not make an opt-out choice themselves. All through these channels, whichever channel, patients have access to information to make sure they're making an informed choice, so that transparency thing again. Bit of an overview of the policy for you. And how the policy is implemented. So we've got a big green box on the side which shows what the opt-out, what the National Data Opt-out will apply to. So it is, again, only where confidential patient information will be used for purposes beyond individual care for health research or planning, okay? Where it won't apply, so it won't apply, as we said, for individual care and treatment. So, sharing of information as part of referral or handing over care from one care provider or professional to another. Summary care record, for example, is again about individual care. So the National Data Opt-out, going back to what Dame Fiona said in her review, we want this to impact on sharing for individual care. There are some other reasons where the National Data Opt-out will not apply. So if there is an overriding legal requirement, so mandatory legal requirements such as CQC powers, such as Section 259 data provision notices, such as reporting of notifiable diseases, and there are obviously plenty more which will be available, but just as an indication. If there is an overriding public interest, so a positive public interest test, that would mean the National Data Opt-out wouldn't apply. And remember, we are talking about for purposes beyond individual care here as well. And if a patient has already given explicit consent for a particular research project, for example, then that will trump the National Data Opt-out. And on the right-hand side, we've got if data is anonymised. Remember, we've said again, the opt-out only applies to confidential patient information. So if data is already anonymised, and when we say anonymised, we mean it has to be in line with the ICO's anonymisation code of practice, okay? So broadly speaking, that gives you a high-level explanation of where the National Data Opt-out applies. Important to say that regardless of the National Data Opt-out, confidential information can't be used for insurance or marketing purposes without explicit consent anyway, so that's always a useful thing to throw in. For those of you that are, if there's anyone on the session that is an IG specialist or has an interest in this, The opt-out applies, like we say, for confidential patient information and where the legal basis to use the data is approved under Section 251, Regulation 542 for use of data without consent, where the CAG, the Confidentiality Advisory Group, have advised on those approvals anyway. When, what and how this one's called. So it is an opt-out across health and care in England. That's useful to know. And the organisations it will apply to or the care that it applies to information about is if it's provided by NHS organisations, and also applies to other publicly funded or coordinated health and adult social care. So self-funded adult social care, if it's organised or coordinated by a local authority, would be included, and privately funded care in an NHS hospital is included, and NHS-funded care in a private provider would be included. It will continue to be applied after a person has died, and it's not limited to electronic data, so paper records, images, etc. would still be within scope of the National Data Opt-out Policy. GDPR. Okay, so it's coming in the same time as GDPR, 25th of May. It's coming in on the same schedule, but it isn't GDPR, and it's not replaced or changed by GDPR or changes to the legislation. It is worth understanding some of this kind of interfaces between the National Data Opt-out and GDPR. Particularly, we often get queries around consent and opting out, opting in, etc. So there are obviously tightened up consent rules within GDPR. But one important thing to state is that if a patient doesn't have a National Data Opt-out, it doesn't mean they have consented to confidential patient information being used for those purposes, because there still needs to be that lawful basis to use the information. It isn't the right to object either. The right to object differs because that will only apply to the organisation that the patient has requested that objection with, and it's down to that data controller to talk about that and consider that as that right to object for that particular organisation. Whereas the National Data Opt-out is a policy. It will apply, the patient sets it themselves, it will apply to all health and care organisations, and they don't need to justify it. So they are two different things, but they may come up as part of a similar discussion. And probably, or both will need to be referenced in the privacy notice that an organisation will need to display or make available as part of the transparency requirements. Another thing to note is that when the new data protection legislation, when it changes, the ICO will probably be, or they will be reviewing their code of practice on anonymisation. So that's just another little interface there with the data protection regulations. There is further guidance around GDPR and IGA for GP practices, and I think Geoff may talk about that in due course, but that's available via the IGA. So a little summary really of workforce-facing products that are going to be available, or how the implementation is going to work with regards to supporting the workforce, so the GP practices and other health and care organisations. NHS Digital have a web page that's up there now. There's some information on there now, broadly outlining the National Data Opt-out. Within a short period of time, there'll be a series of fact sheets and information available on there to set out some of the things in more detail that we've been talking about already. Q&As as well are going to be published on there. Obviously, the next thing is talking about what we are here with here supporting GP practices. We've also got the Royal College of Nursing looking at the nursing side of it, and there are also going to be specialist products to support those IG specialists in health and social care. So some checklists, policy guidance, that kind of information will be out, and letters for awareness of chief execs, and of course the data security and protection toolkit again for the IG people. I'm going to hand back to Joe now. Give you a whistle stop tour.
Cheers. I think that was a really helpful context setting, and it really gives a really clear overview of what this is all about. I guess what we want to get to next is actually what are the key messages, what are the relevant elements for GP teams. But before we do that, I'm going to talk briefly about what the college is doing. So why are we delivering this project, Patient Data Choices, and what are we aiming to achieve with that project, and what are we hoping to produce in terms of outputs? So the first thing just to say is that this project sits within the RCGP's Clinical Innovation Research Centre, and that is alongside other RCGP projects like Patient Online, GP at Scale, Person-Centred Care. So those are more mature programs of work that you've probably heard of, and it does fit right in with that and within the innovation team. So just a quick overview of the program itself. So we've been commissioned by NHS Digital. So just if we refer back to that slide we had there, the Patient Data Choices program fits within the broader national program, and it's the bit that really focuses on primary care, and obviously that's our MO. So we are talking about general practice teams. It's not just general practitioners. We recognise that this is something that potentially affects people in the team in different ways, and we'll get to it. Our resources and guidance that we're producing will reflect that. So we're trying to look at key messages, but not just key messages as a whole, but actually what's relevant to me as a practice manager or a receptionist or a GPM, etc. We're working closely with NHS Digital. Hopefully that should be pretty obvious. And this is a 12-month project to begin with, and we're really in that first half of the project, and we're just coming to the midway point. And we have Geoff, who's our clinical lead, but we also work with Joyce Pickering, who's a GPN based down in the southwest. So what are the aims of the project? Well, really broadly, we're aiming to support GP teams so that they can confidently and accurately inform patients when those patients come to the practice asking about what their data sharing options and opt-out options are. And we're anticipating this to happen once some of those comms that Dawn's described really start to hit. So we want to make sure that GP teams are ready for that and the advice that they're giving is consistent with what everybody else is saying. So that's really important. And so there's an element of awareness raising that goes on with that, making sure people are aware that this is happening, and this is part of what this webinar is about today. The other part of it is about helping to ensure that GP teams are able to uphold the national data opt-out when it becomes available to the public in May this year, about a month's time, to the day, in fact, I think. And yeah, and so part of that is for us is about looking at the resources, the guidance, how to use the templates that we're producing, how to uphold, what are the responsibilities that involve there, and what are the timescales. So just to break it down a step further, a lot of this work has been on engagement, talking to people, be they patient groups and carer groups, GPs, teams. So that's what we've been doing, and this is really, I think, fits within that. We're hoping to share information about what's going on and raise awareness and really hopefully respond to any things that you've been thinking of and wondering about and answer those questions. But also, this is a chance to sort of send us your comments and questions, and we'll try and deal with them in the time that we have. We're also developing a toolkit in e-learning. It's a big piece of work for us at the moment, and they are going to be available on, well, the first one on the RCGP website in our clinical area of the website alongside our other toolkits, and the e-learning will be available on our RCGP e-learning platform. And they serve different purposes, but they'll all be interlinked, and there'll be lots of signposting there to NHS Digital resources as well. And we're hoping that if you have a question, that it'll be answered in there somewhere, and indeed, if that's why we're talking to people, engaging to make sure that we're answering all the questions with that work. And there'll be more resources that we produce through that. The big event that we're holding in London on the 24th of May is a symposium. that I've already mentioned, but it's worth repeating. And this is really going to be the launch date for the toolkit for the e-learning. The 25th, the day after, is the sort of go live date for the opt-out system itself. So it's all coming together at that point. Stage 2, we're going to continue producing resources, continue to listen to what people need in terms of what support would be useful. So that means talking to GPs, practice managers, Caldecott guardians within the practice, etc. And it's about using webinars, events, videos, or infographics, those sorts of resources, and making sure that the templates that we can provide, it's not just about information, but it's also about actually this is something that you can embed within your practice so it's useful, or here's a checklist that you can use, or signposting to other resources where necessary. And that's basically the RCGP overview, but I'm going to hand over to you, Geoff, for the next section.
Good. Thank you, Joe. So now that you've heard what it is and what tools we're producing, it falls to me to talk about why you should actually be interested in the tools that we're producing and might want to use them. So I'm going to be talking about how the toolkits will help you, what are the timelines, what do you actually need to be doing, and what support will be available for you. The first thing to say, on a number of sessions we've been asked, why do I have to do this? Well, the answer is you have to do it for the same reason that you have to know how to take a blood pressure and you have to know how to use your ophthalmoscope. You're the data controller, you're using data, and this is a responsibility of the data controller. So whether you like it or not, you've got to understand how this is working and how you can comply with your duties. You're collecting a lot of data about your patients. It's essential for your practice, but under the law, you've got to be transparent. You've got to inform your patients how you use their data. And if you're going to do the job, your patients have to feel comfortable and confident sharing their information with you. You can't manage a patient who is afraid to tell you things because they don't know where that information is going to go. And so they withhold information from you. So it's important that you are fully aware of what's happening and you can be fully open with your patients about it. And this national data opt-out is a policy in the National Health Service about how this data is going to be handled. So you need to be aware of that so that you can discuss it with your patients if they so desire. In general practice, in medicine as a whole, we depend on trust. We are the most trusted profession, but we have to stay that way. And trust depends on people knowing us and knowing that we're being open and honest with them. There's a nice concept that trust depends on trustworthiness. And so if we're to maintain that trust, we must remain trustworthy. That doesn't mean we need to know the answer to everything all the time. Frequently during my clinical practice, I would refer to my BNF or look at the interactions on my IT system. The important thing is that you know where to look. So if patients are asking about these issues, you don't have to hold all the answers in your head, but you do need to know that there's an issue and where you can go to find the answer. We've mentioned the key dates, we'll mention them again, they're critically important. 25th of May, patients are able to set their national data opt-out if they wish to. Type 2 objections disappear on the 25th of May. Up until now, you've been adding type 2 objections using a code in the clinical record. If you add any on the 25th of May or thereafter, they won't be effective. They will no longer be uploaded. Everyone who has a type 2 objection recorded before the 25th of May will automatically have a national data opt-out set. From the 25th of May, NHS Digital will also uphold national data opt-outs in their processing of data. So any data that NHS Digital hold for patients who've set a type 2 will have a national data opt-out applied and will not then be shared in identifiable form with anybody else under any of the other any processes that NHS Digital might be doing. NHS Digital will still hold that data, but the opt-out will be respected for its processing. By March 2020, everybody, and that includes us in general practice, will have to be upholding national data opt-outs. So I briefly mentioned the type 2 objections. Up until now, we're probably all familiar. We may be familiar with them by different names. The 9NU0 code for type 1 and the other code, which I can't remember off the top of my head, for type 2. Type 1 being the objection which means that data doesn't flow out of your GP record anywhere. And the type 2 meaning that data wouldn't flow from Health and Social Care Information Centre, as it was when the type 2 was introduced, NHS Digital as it's now called. These codes were set GP by entering a code into the record. The new national data opt-out is set by the patient themselves and replaces the type 2. The type 1 objection continues for the moment and is subject to review in March 2020. This review, at this point, a decision will be taken in consultation with the National Data Guardian about whether the type 1 objection persists or is removed. So what are we doing to help to explain this in more detail? Because obviously we're not going to cover it in a brief webinar. We're producing a toolkit. Some of you may have used the RCGP toolkits already, the patient online toolkit, some of the clinical toolkits. But basically it's an online resource broken into sections. Each section, if you press the plus at beside the introduction or background, that will expand to show a section summary. And then below that, there will be further detail. Where there's not a lot, that will be within the web page. But where there's a lot of detail, that will be as a downloaded PDF, which you can download and read on your computer or laptop. Each section also contains a large volume of resources. These will be links to other sites giving information, NHS Digital resources, and any other resources that are useful and relevant. So what are our toolkit headings? We're going to have, obviously, an introduction and summary, which covers a lot of the background we've covered today. Key messages, so if you've got people who are in a hurry, it tells you the bare essentials of what you need to know. A section about accessibility, because obviously a lot of our patients, maybe English isn't their first language, maybe they have learning difficulties, maybe they need large print, braille, signed materials. All those materials are going to be available, and this section will signpost to where people can find those materials. Then further background, description of the national data opt-out, a section on how patients actually set the national data opt-out, and the detail of the issues that Dawn referred to earlier of exactly what it applies to, how and when it's applied, and when it doesn't apply, how it fits with legislation, and the transition from the current situation to the national data opt-out. So the migration of type 2s, and then what will happen as we transition through that period until the decision's made in 2020 about what happens with type 1s. There's also an important section on preparing your practice. So what you need to do in your practice to make sure that you're ready on the 25th of May and also going forward from the 25th of May. We've also produced an e-learning course. Some of you may have done the RCGP CERC e-learning materials. Basically, it's a series of slides and information. It starts with a quiz to see what you know before you start. The material then runs through what you need to know, and you do the quiz at the end to see if you've learnt anything. And if you have, you get a certificate. The e-learning modules take about 30 minutes to complete. This first one is about the information that you need now to support patients. The second one will come along later and will be about what you need to do in terms of upholding the opt-out in your practice. In addition to this, we're producing videos. These will be short videos aimed at individual members of the practice team. So there'll be a short video for receptionists, practice managers, practice nurses, etc. And these will be just 3 to 5 minute videos, again covering the essentials for each of those members of the practice team. You won't be surprised to learn that we're doing webinars since you're on one. And we're also holding stakeholder meetings. We've held a couple so far in different faculties where we have presentations and then roundtable discussion with people to see what they need from us and if we're producing the right materials. There are, of course, lots of other resources about this. NHS Digital have a website with resources. The Wellcome Trust have been contributing to a project called Understanding Patient Data, which provides a lot of useful resources for patients to understand why we're trying to do other things with data other than just look after them. And it's certainly well worth signposting patients to those materials. The Information Governance Alliance comes under the NHS Digital, and they are producing a lot of materials to support practices over information governance. The main focus at the moment, of course, being GDPR, but it's not just about GDPR. And of course, the Information Commissioner's Office is the ultimate arbiter on all of these matters and the person whose advice you should be aware of and heed at all times. So between now and the 25th of May, as you leave this webinar in a state of heightened anxiety, wondering what you need to do next, it's actually quite straightforward. You need to review your existing materials, particularly any that make referral to type 1 or type 2 opt-outs. Because of the changes, you need to make sure that you're not, for example, still handing out a registration form that gives patients a box to tick to register a type 2 objection, because that will cease to exist. If you have any notices up in your waiting room or materials on your practice website that refer to that, again, they need to be updated. Your privacy notice will need to be updated, and there is actually a template text being produced by NHS Digital, which you can simply cut and paste into your privacy notice that covers the issues related to the opt-out. You need to make sure that all your staff know about it. They don't need to know the detail about it. They don't need to know anything really except that it's happening and where to look if a patient does ask. So if a patient comes to your reception desk on the 25th of May, having heard something on the radio in the morning on Jeremy Vine, they can come to the reception and the receptionist doesn't look at them blankly, but says, yes, of course, I have information here for you. I can give you a leaflet. I can point you to the website. However, your practice is choosing to pass on that information. I would recommend identifying a lead in the practice, somebody who's going to take this forward, who will understand rather more of the detail than is expected of everybody else in the practice. And perhaps the most important of all is to make sure that nobody is going to add a type 2 objection code on or after the 25th of May. It's really vital that whoever in your practice is responsible for managing this process and for doing the coding knows that that stops on the 25th of May and no further type 2 codes are added. So that covers what we're providing. I see we've had a couple of questions come in.
Yeah, so we've got a few questions that we've received, as I mentioned earlier, when we talked to people and people who couldn't make the webinar sent questions in, and we've also got some questions that have come in through the chat as well. I'm going to start with one that comes up a lot when we speak to people and play devil's advocate, and ask you, is this just care.data too?
No, it's not care.data 2. Just to be clear that the care.data programme did close in 2016 without the data having been collected. As we've said, the National Data Opt-out is in response to the National Data Guardian's independent review to say we should offer the patients, the public, more transparency and reassurance around the use of data now and ongoing, and so the National Data Opt-out is introducing that.
Okay. Anything else to that, Geoff?
I think we've had a comment come in through the chat, and I think more relevant to that would be the fate of the Type 1 objection. So obviously, if people have feelings about that, then they need to raise those through the National Data Guardian and make sure that she's aware of that.
Great, okay. So the other question that we get a lot is this the same as GDPR? So I think perhaps if we can sort of deal with that one as well.
Again, I think that it's, in some ways it's good, and in some ways it's unfortunate that the opt-out and GDPR come at the same time. It does, with GDPR being around, I think it has heightened awareness of the issues around information governance, and people are more alert to it. But the opt-out is not part of GDPR. It's not the same as GDPR, but it does sit alongside GDPR, and I think that's the message I would give.
I think it's a policy and offer in addition to the GDPR rights, the legal rights.
Yeah. But you do need, in addition to understanding the opt-out, you need to make sure that you understand all the rest of the stuff that GDPR is about. That's really important.
Great, thanks. So I think there's a couple of questions I've got here. One of them is one that we've received already, and there's another that's also from Jenny, and thank you, Jenny, for your question, by the way, but for the GDPR question. So Jenny's question is, how will patients opt out if it's not happening through GP practice? And I think that sort of ties into this other question that we've received, which is about why do I have to do this? Which is sort of, I guess, about responsibility. What's the responsibility?
And I see that Ralph's just chipped in on that one as well.
Yeah.
So there are 3 ways in which you can opt out. Dawn, do you want to just talk through briefly?
I mean, I'll go through the service on NHS UK. Oh, yeah, skip back to number 13. 13. Yes, so the digital service via NHS UK, the patient will need their NHS number, date of birth, and they will need access to the mobile telephone number or email address that's registered on PDS for them in order to carry out the full transaction via NHS UK. There will be guidance about, I see the question on screen about how the patient find their NHS number. There is guidance as part of the process about where a patient may find their NHS number, which is similar to materials on NHS Choices and things at the minute. So saying that it should be on any correspondence, on a prescription, maybe via their online services, they can access it that way. If they don't know their NHS number and they don't have those information, we have still got the telephone route for them to do the kind of assisted digital or the on behalf of option. So you don't have to have all of those things that prevent you from registering a national data opt-out. Did that answer the question? I can't remember if I've got all of them there.
I think the key messages there are that you can do it online, but you would need your NHS number. If you don't have your NHS number, there are other routes you can use, including the telephone line. And if you want to, you can request, I think through the telephone line to get paper forms that you can then complete.
Yeah. Recognising that not everybody does have the you know, even if you've got their NHS number, they may not have a mobile or telephone or email address that they have access to.
Absolutely.
There has to be another route.
Yeah.
Great. So we've got another question that we've received today from Neil. So thank you, Neil, for sending that in. And that is, could you address what will happen to the type 1 opt-out in due course? Are patients going to lose the right to prevent extraction and uploading of identifiable data from the GP record for non-direct care purposes?
Right. So I think I also saw, Neil, that you popped up a question about what's happening to type 1s from the 25th of May. So the answer is type 1 from the 25th of May continues. You can still add and code and record a type 1 on somebody's records if they want to do that. The question for what happens in March 2020 is more difficult because we don't know the answer. The National Data Guardian's report considered that NHS Digital would be considered a trusted safe haven for data. And if that were the case, then it would no longer be necessary to have the type 1 opt-out. However, obviously, that depends on NHS Digital being considered a trusted safe haven for data. With that in mind, the policy at present is that type 1 may well end in March 2020, but would only do so in discussion with and with the assent of the National Data Guardian. So it's an open question at the moment. I think it's probably one that will be the subject of considerable debate between now and then. And ultimately, I think if people do have concerns about that, they do need to raise the issue with the National Data Guardian, I think. Yeah. So hopefully that covers that. Yeah.
Great. So just had another question from Michael. So thank you, Michael. How does the opt-out consent process confirm that the applicant has capacity, is informed, and is acting voluntarily?
Opt-out consent. So the mechanism to opt out is based on anybody being 13 or over, 13 and over. How can it be 13 or over? Yeah, 13 and over. The capacity issue, unless there is a formal proxy relationship, a formal proxy that takes over that capacity, such as lasting power of attorney. Otherwise, the capacity, as the policy is set out, is assumed by the fact you're going through and doing it. And the age of 13 is set in alignment with some of the other aspects of GDPR, etc., and the legal rights. Remember, this isn't about individual care. Again, this is about purposes beyond individual care, so that their individual care information is not affected.
Great, thank you. I guess this is the obligatory time to call for any other questions whilst we're on. So we've just had one come through from Neil, but do please keep sending them in because we're here for the next few minutes. So if you have any burning questions, and now's the time to grab us.
So Neil's just sent in, can parents set that? Yes, they can. Anyone with parental responsibility can set an opt-out for a child under the age of 13.
They will have to
up to the age of 13, rather.
They will have to use the non-digital route to do that, so they'll have to go by the telephone service.
That's right. So anyone setting an opt-out, either using a lasting power of attorney or parental responsibility, has to do so through the non-digital route. But yes, absolutely they can. That will then persist until that person reaches the age of 13. I'm not sure what the policy is after that, and I think that's still under discussion, is exactly how that then transitions once the young person reaches the age of 13.
Great. I'm not sure if we've already covered this, but one of the other questions that we received was, what can I do if I find out someone has recorded a type 2 opt-out after the 25th of May? Have we covered?
No,
we didn't.
Well, I think that's a very important point. We highlighted that you mustn't add any, but accidents do happen. If you do discover that you've recorded a type 2 after the 25th of May, you would need to contact the patient and say, I see you've expressed this wish, but actually the process has changed now, and you would need to give them advice on what they need to do to register their own opt-out. I'm a little bit paranoid about things like this, and I would also suggest that practices may wish to set up on their clinical system just a scheduled search to run for a few weeks, maybe a few months, just to do a sweep to make sure that no new type 2 codes have been added since the 25th of May, and to contact those patients if they do find any. It's a quick and simple thing to do in GP clinical systems. Just run it once a week and check there's nobody in it would be my suggestion.
The codes are being, will be, I've forgotten what the term is, but the codes will be taken out, but we all recognise that takes a little while to happen. So it's from the October.
The codes will disappear from your picking lists, but will still be present in the system, because you can't actually remove a read or CTV3 code once it's there. But it would become a great deal more difficult to use a code inappropriately, but that will require the system suppliers to make some changes to their read code and CTV code picking systems. So that will take a little time. And I would suggest until that happens, it's well worth just having a little routine scheduled search that checks that there hasn't been a slip up.
Great. So I guess this is your final warning. So if you can, if you do have a burning question, please send it through.
We have an email address. Yeah. If you think of something afterwards and you think, oh golly, I wish I'd asked that, if you send an email to patientdatachoices@rcgp.org.uk, we will do our best to answer or to explain to you that we can't answer.
Yeah, and if the question comes in after the launch of the toolkit, then hopefully we will have something that we can actually signpost you directly to that gives you further information. Also, Ralph is saying that we missed his question. I didn't know.
No, he asked a question that we'd missed earlier. Oh, about the NHS number. Is there another question there, Ralph? Type quickly.
So yeah.
Oh, how would a patient be able to remind themselves of how their opt-out is set if they cannot use the digital route to check it? It's about how patients check their opt-out.
Okay, any of those channels will enable the patients to check. They can use a telephone or the digital route to remind themselves or change it. What we perhaps haven't said is the patient can change their choice at any time as well, or review or change it. Yeah.
And of course, your opt-out setting is a piece of data which is held about you by NHS Digital as data controller. So of course, if you make a subject access request to NHS Digital for the information that they hold on you, that would include your opt-out status.
I'm entirely sure that you're correct, but it's meant to be simpler than that. You should be able to just use the same service you've used initially.
If you've written in, you would have to write in and ask again, presumably, if you've used the paper-based system.
I may need to follow up that, but the idea being you can use any of those channels
through the channel. Yeah. Thanks, Ralph. Yeah, that's good.
Great, and thanks to everyone that sent a question in. I think this is my sort of final plug for the national event, but the national event is the only thing at the moment we've got scheduled in the diary. We are planning to run some more events later in the year to really sort of basically go into some of these topics in a bit more detail and talk about actually practical steps to upholding or the guidance that can be given around communicating choice, etc. But we'll be talking about some of these things at the national event on the 24th. It's based in London. It's the day before the system's launched. And as I mentioned, we've got Dame Fiona Caldicott coming on to give us a keynote talk and set the context for the day. There'll also be a demo of the system itself. And we have colleagues from NHS Digital and from the Wellcome Trust presenting and talking more about communicating choice and what that means. So it's going to be a really fantastic day, and you will be fed as well. And I made
There is a free lunch.
Yeah, you'll be fed, and I made sure that there was lots of tea and coffee as well.
It's also an opportunity if people do have questions for Dame Fiona or Helen Stokes-Lampard, our RCGP chair, about the detail of this. It's an opportunity to put those questions directly, as there is a panel with Dame Fiona and Helen on it.
Absolutely, it's a Q&A panel. It's actually Victoria, our joint on sec that's joining for the whole session. But a senior representative of the college,
and Dame Fiona herself.
Yeah, and we'll be sending information about that out to everyone that's registered for this webinar, just so you've got it. And if there are no further questions, I think we can probably end there.
And have a cup of tea.
And have a cup of tea, yeah. Unless there's anything further that you would like to add.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah.
I know it's not the most gripping of subjects. It's boring but essential.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks again for your questions and for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Yep.